The wind was a blade, sharp enough to peel skin from bone. Elias felt it in the hollows of his cheeks, a familiar ache that mirrored the one in his soul. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, his gaze fixed on the churn of white ahead. It wasn't a blizzard, not yet, but the sky was a bruised and swollen gray, promising a world of hurt. He wasn't tracking elk or wolf. He was tracking a ghost, a whisper brought by a half-frozen trapper who'd stumbled into his valley 2 days prior. A broken wagon, the man had gasped, teeth chattering. A woman, a child, north of the ridge, lost. Elias had saddled his horse before the man had finished his stew. He knew that ridge. It was a place where hope went to die. He found them where the trapper said they would be. The wagon was a skeleton of splintered wood. One wheel snapped clean off, lying half-buried in a drift like a fallen shield. The horse was a frozen statue, a testament to a desperate struggle against the inevitable. There was no movement. A profound, deathly stillness hung in the air, broken only by the keening of the wind. For a moment, Elias considered turning back. The graves on the hill behind his cabin were a constant reminder of what the wilderness took. He had no more room for ghosts, but the mention of a child had snagged in his gut, a hook he couldn't shake loose. He dismounted, the crunch of his boots on the snow unnaturally loud. He approached the covered wagon, his hand resting on the colt at his hip, a habit from a life he'd tried to bury. He pulled back the stiff, frozen canvas. The cold that hit him was different. It was the cold of a tomb. Inside, a woman lay on a bed of damp blankets, her face ashen, her lips the color of a winter twilight. She was breathing, but barely. A shallow, ragged flutter in her chest. Curled against her, so small he almost missed him, was a boy. His eyes were wide open, two dark, bottomless pools in a pale face. He did not cry. He did not move. He just stared, a silent witness to the world's quiet cruelty. The woman's eyes flickered open as Elias's shadow fell over them. Panic, pure and primal, flashed in their depths. She tried to shield the boy, a pathetic, weak gesture that cost her what little strength she had. Her whisper was a dry rasp of air.
No.
Please. Elias said nothing. Words were useless things here. He reached not for her, but for a thick wool blanket he'd strapped to his saddle. He gently wrapped it around the boy, who remained rigid, his gaze never leaving Elias's face. He lifted the child. He was light, terrifyingly so, a bundle of twigs in his arms. The boy did not resist. He simply endured. Then Elias turned back to the woman. She watched him, her fear warring with a creeping exhaustion. He saw the dark bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the split in her lip that was not from the cold. He saw the terror in her eyes, and knew it was not of the storm, but of men. He knelt. "I'm not him," he said. The words felt rough in his throat, and used. She flinched at the sound, but something in his tone, a low baritone of immense weariness, seemed to register. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed less than the boy. As he carried them to his horse, the first heavy flakes of the blizzard began to fall, thick and fast, trying to erase them from the landscape, to swallow them whole. Elias settled them on the horse, the boy in front of him, the woman slumped against his back, and turned toward the faint promise of home, a single thread of smoke rising from a valley that was both his sanctuary and his prison. The cabin was one room, built of sturdy pine that had weathered a dozen winters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth black with soot. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. Lena woke to the smell of wood smoke and broth. For a long moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the cold, a deep, penetrating force that had promised a final, peaceful darkness. Now there was warmth. A fire crackled in a hearth, its light dancing on the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling. A heavy quilt was tucked around her chin. She was on a cot in the corner of the room. Across the small space, the boy, Samuel, sat at a wooden table, his small hands wrapped around a tin cup of what smelled like the same broth she could taste on the air. He was watching the man, Elias, moved with a quiet economy. He stoked the fire, his back to them, broad and solid. He was big, but he made almost no sound. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the fire and the wind howling outside, a beast trying to claw its way in. Lena tried to sit up, a sharp pain lancing through her ribs. She choked back a gasp, but he heard it. He turned. His face was stark in the firelight, all hard plains and shadow. A jagged scar ran from his temple down his jaw, a white line against his weathered skin. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held no warmth, but no malice either. They were simply tired. He walked over, holding a bowl of the broth. He didn't offer it, just stood there, waiting. She stared at his hands. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked the land, who fought. But the way he held the bowl was steady, gentle. She slowly pushed herself up, biting her lip against the pain. She took the bowl. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was paper-thin and cold. His was rough and warm. The brief contact was like a spark, and she pulled her hand back quickly. He retreated to the fireplace without a word. For 3 days the blizzard raged. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. A strange, silent routine emerged. Elias would tend the fire, fetch snow to melt for water, and check on his lone horse in the attached lean-to. Lena would rest, her body slowly mending. Samuel remained a phantom. He ate what was put before him, watched everything with those unnerving eyes, and never made a sound. He slept on a pallet of furs near the hearth, as close to the warmth as he could get. Lena watched Elias when she thought he wasn't looking. He was haunted. She could see it in the way he stared into the flames, his jaw tight, his gaze 1,000 miles away. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him murmur in his sleep. A name, Sarah. Then a smaller, softer name, Daniel. One afternoon, the storm broke. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elias put on his coat. "Need to check the fences," he said, his voice gravelly. Lena watched him go. Samuel, who had been sitting by the fire, stood up. He walked to the door and watched the man's figure recede into the vast, white landscape. He stayed there for a long time. The next day he followed him out. Lena's heart seized with panic. She threw a blanket around her shoulders and stumbled to the door. She saw them out by the corral. Elias was resetting a fence post, his movements strong and sure. Samuel stood a few feet away, a small, still shape against the snow. He wasn't helping. He was just watching, bearing witness. Lena felt an unfamiliar feeling unfurl in her chest. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was the absence of immediate fear. She realized she didn't know this man's name. That night, as he ladled stew into her bowl, she found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered. He paused, looking at her for the first time since she'd woken up. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Lena," she said. "My name is Lena. The boy is Samuel." He looked from her to the boy, who was watching them both. "Elias," he said. The name hung in the air between them. It was the first brick laid in a foundation she never thought she'd have again. As the snow began to melt, revealing the hard, brown earth beneath, the silence in the cabin began to thaw as well. It was replaced by the small sounds of life, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft thud of Elias's axe splitting firewood. One day, Lena felt strong enough to sweep the floor. Elias came in from the cold and stopped, watching her. He said nothing, but he took off his snow-caked boots by the door, a small gesture of respect that spoke volumes. Samuel started to venture further. He would follow Elias on his rounds, a silent shadow. He would watch him feed the horse, his small face rapt with concentration. Elias, in turn, never pushed him. He simply allowed him to be there, accepting his silent presence as he accepted the sunrise. He started leaving small scraps of wood and a whittling knife on the table. For days, Samuel ignored them. Then one morning, Lena woke to find the boy sitting at the table, carefully shaving slivers from a piece of pine. He was carving a horse. It was clumsy and disproportionate, but it was something he was creating, not just observing. Lena found herself mending Elias's shirt, the needle awkward in her unpracticed fingers. He found it folded on his cot and held it up, running a thumb over her uneven stitches. Their eyes met across the room. A question passed between them, unspoken. "Who are you? What broke you?" That evening, the quiet was deeper, more comfortable. "My husband," Lena said suddenly, her voice low. She was staring into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. "He'll come looking." Elias stopped cleaning his rifle. He looked at the bruise on her cheek, now a faint yellow shadow. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "This valley is hard to find," he said. "He's a hard man," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He collects things. Beautiful things. He thinks we belong to him." Elias's jaw tightened. He knew men like that. Men who saw the world as theirs for the taking. He looked at the fresh scar on Lena's hand, where she'd burned herself on the stew pot a week ago. He thought of his own scars, the ones on his skin and the deeper ones on his heart. He'd earned his in a war, fighting for a cause he no longer believed in. He'd come home to a different kind of war. Sickness had taken his wife, Sarah, then his infant son, Daniel. The doctor had told him the fever that almost took him too had left him barren, unable to father another child. The ranch wasn't a home. It was a monument to that emptiness, a place for one forgotten soul. Now there were three. "He won't find you here," he repeated. But this time it sounded less like a statement and more like a vow. The day the first meadowlark sang, Silas came. He didn't ride in like a storm. He arrived like a plague. He came on a fine black stallion, 2 hired men flanking him, their faces hard and cruel. They stopped at the edge of the property, just beyond the newly mended fence. Elias saw them from the barn. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He'd known this day might come. He walked out to meet them, his gait steady, his old colt heavy on his hip. Lena appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her face drained of all color. Samuel scrambled behind her, peering out from behind her legs. Silas was a handsome man, dressed in a fine coat and leather gloves. His smile didn't reach his cold, possessive eyes. "I believe you have something of mine," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed. "Nothing here belongs to you," Elias said, his own voice a low rumble. Silas's gaze flickered to the cabin, and his smile tightened when he saw Lena. "My dear, you look rustic. This wilderness doesn't suit you. Come now. Our boy has been missing his mother," he gestured to Samuel. Lena put a protective hand on the boy's head. "He is not your son," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He is not a thing you can own." Silas's mask of civility slipped. "I paid good money for him. For both of you. You are my property." He looked back at Elias, his eyes full of contempt. "I don't know who you are, old man, but you are in my way. Give them to me, and I'll let you live out your miserable existence in this hovel." Elias's hand moved from his side, resting on the top of the fence post he and Samuel had fixed together. He thought of the empty graves on the hill. He thought of the silence that had filled this cabin for years. He thought of the sound of Samuel's knife on wood, of the weight of his own shirt mended by Lena's hand. This was no longer a hovel. It was becoming a home. "You should go," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Kill him," he ordered his men. The world exploded. The crack of Elias's colt was deafening in the spring air. One of the hired men grunted and fell from his saddle before his own gun was even clear of its holster. The second man fired wide as Elias dove behind the water trough, the splintering wood spraying his face. The skills of war, long dormant, came back with a bitter, familiar ease. He moved, fired, moved again. It was a brutal, efficient dance he hated. He saw Lena pulling Samuel back inside the cabin, her face a mask of terror. Silas, enraged, spurred his horse forward, drawing a silver-inlaid pistol. He wasn't aiming for Elias. He was aiming for the cabin door. For Lena. A primal roar tore from Elias's throat. He surged up from behind the trough, ignoring the second hired man, and fired twice. The first shot struck Silas's horse, which screamed and went down in a tangle of legs. The second hit Silas in the shoulder as he fell, his pistol skittering away into the mud. The remaining hired man, seeing his employer down and his partner dead, wheeled his horse around and fled. A coward's retreat. Silence descended again, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Elias walked slowly towards Silas, who was clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. "They're not property," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He stood over the man who had brought the ugly, outside world crashing into his sanctuary. He could end it. One more shot and the threat would be gone forever. He looked up and saw Lena in the doorway. She was holding his old hunting rifle, her hands trembling but her aim steady on Silas. Behind her, Samuel held the small, whittled horse in his hand like a talisman. They were not watching him with fear. They were watching with a fierce, shared purpose. They were a family, forged in this moment of violence. Elias lowered his gun. Killing Silas would make him no different. He was a builder now, not a destroyer. "Get up," he said, his voice hard as iron, "and get out of my valley. If you ever come back, I'll bury you on that hill myself." Silas scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, his arrogance shattered. He stumbled away down the path, a broken man leaving a place he could not conquer. The aftermath was quiet. Elias walked back to the cabin, every step an effort. The violence had left him feeling hollowed out, sickened. Lena met him at the door. She didn't say anything. She just reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. Her touch was no longer a fleeting spark but a steady, grounding warmth. Samuel came forward and pressed the small wooden horse into Elias's other hand. Elias looked down at the crude carving, then at the boy. For the first time, Samuel's eyes were not filled with a haunted emptiness. They were clear. He looked from Elias to Lena, and then he spoke. His voice was small, rusty from disuse, but the word was unmistakable. Home. Elias felt the tight, frozen knot in his chest, the one he had carried since Sarah and Daniel had died, finally begin to loosen. He looked out over his land. It was no longer a place of penance, a monument to what was lost. The melting snow fed green shoots pushing up from the dark soil. The fence was mended. The cabin was filled not with ghosts, but with the quiet breathing of the living. He squeezed Lena's hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. He had thought his life's purpose was to be alone, to tend the graves of his past. He had been wrong. His purpose was to build a haven, a place for every forgotten child, for every broken soul. He had started with two. He looked at Lena, at Samuel, and for the first time in a decade, he saw the promise of a future, as vast and hopeful as the valley spread out before them.